I am Sarah. I'll be talking about the second Shorebird NESP project, which is NESP 4.26, and it's all about migration and what that means for disease incursion risk. This is a collaborative effort between us here at Deakin University and all for the Alfred Wegener Institute, which is where our partner Simeon Lasovsky works, and we work a lot with data from the Victorian Waiter Study Group. So before I start talking about science, I wanted to do just a quick acknowledgement of country. I am originally from Sweden. I'm actually wearing a shirt that has European birds on it. And I think growing up in Sweden, it's very easy to become enthusiastic about nature and the environment. And so with that in mind, I would like to extend my thanks to the traditional custodians of the land who have been such great custodians to the land on which we all live and work. And yes, to point out as well that sovereignty was never ceded. So let's talk about migration. Toby covered the East Asian-Australasian Flyway and how big it is and what it means. But I think it also, when we talk about migration as a trait, I think it's also worth bearing in mind, why do birds do it, right? So why would a bird want to move all the way from Australia down here up until the Arctic or parts of Asia and back down every year? And one of those reasons is about maximizing resources. By making use of Arctic sort of spring and summer, they can get access to those resources that pop up, and then same thing down here in Australia. But by doing these long distance migration, they get exposed to a lot of different environments. And that is perhaps exacerbated by the fact that they'll be exposed to climate change across the world. So they don't just have to think about climate change down here in Australia. They have to also think about Arctic amplification and how climate change impacts the Arctic. We also see on quite a broad scale degradation of habitat. Again, not just in Australia and New Zealand's beaches where we know that there is habitat degradation. There are also land reclamation projects along the Asian coast, such as the one that Toby mentioned in relation to some of those survival estimates. And then there's sort of other processes that are also occurring that the birds will inevitably get exposed to. Another reason that migration is a really interesting trait is not just because it's the reason that they get exposed to all of these environments and processes, but also it's a phenological event. And we have seen in a lot of different studies that phenological events can be changing because of climate change. So what are we interested in when it comes to migration and phenology for the birds? Well, there are three key questions that are of interest, and I'm going to talk to you about two of those questions, but if you're interested in the third, just let me know. The first question is about what parts of migration are changing. Is it their migration from Australia up to the Arctic? Or is it the other way around? Is it from the Arctic to Australia that's changing? Is it just their departure dates or the window in which they're migrating? Or is it the duration of the migrations? We're also interested in why is it changing, right? Are there climatic variables that are at play, or are there other things that are occurring that are causing these changes? And then that third question, which I won't cover today, but I can talk about if anybody's interested, is about how it's changing. What's the mechanism? Is there an evolutionary response, or is there individual plasticity within the birds that causes any changes? So let's talk about these two questions. But before, I'll talk briefly about the birds that we're working in. So I'm going to talk mostly about ruddy turnstones, which are some of the shorebirds that live along Australia's coasts, and then they migrate and breed up here in the high Arctic. So they cover really the full spectrum of the East Asian-Australasian Flyway. We catch them with the Victorian Waiter Study Group using cannon netting, which Toby alluded to earlier. It basically means that if you look really closely, you'll see that there is a sort of net set up here. We wait for the birds to walk around into this area. So the birds will be running around here on the beach, and then boom, out goes the net, and we catch them underneath the net. When we catch the birds, we take various samples to test for things like disease. We also band them and flag them, as Toby covered earlier. And we put geolocators on a couple of them. Now, a geolocator is this little gray thing that you can see on his tarsus there. And the geolocator, it works by measuring light levels at twilight. And so by measuring those light levels and calibrating them in reference to a known location where we know what twilight events look like, you can basically then estimate their location in the flyway based off of the light levels that they experience at those times of day. And from that, we can get information on roughly where they are and when they are there. So what does it look like for our ruddy turnstones? We started this, I say we, I was not part of this project at the start, but they started this in 2009, which is when Simeon was doing his PhD down here in Australia. And we've been putting geolocators on the birds all the way until 2024. So we have this incredible data set of ruddy turnstone geolocators. On the right here, you'll see examples of what some of those tracks look like, where the orange is the northward migration. Each of the bubbles here shows a location where they've been. The bigger the bubble, the longer they were there. And then in green, you see the southward migration. And we have this data for nearly 400 geolocator tracks from over 200 individual birds. So not only do we have a really great number of individual tracks, but we have repeats for some individual birds, which is really great. Now, migration is obviously a process. It is not necessarily just that we're interested in when they leave from Australia. We're interested in the whole cycle and what happens with the whole cycle. So when we look at what parts of migration are changing, we can be interested in departure from southeastern Australia, but that might in itself have an impact on their northward migration duration or on their arrival at the breeding grounds, while simultaneously any of these steps can be changing sort of independently through time. So to analyze any changes in migration in a way that accounts for each of the steps but allows us to look at if they are changing, we used a Bayesian structural equation model. And that basically means that we can analyze all of these sort of in one and understand their effects on each other. And I'm going to talk to you today about this structural equation model. Now, structural equation models are slightly complicated because I am going to end up showing you something that looks like this with this whole circle going on, but also showing you what is impacting each of these steps. So we're going to go through it really slowly. Let's start with the first step, and that's departure from Australia. Departure from Australia is changing through time, so it is becoming earlier. Year is having a negative effect. That means that they are leaving Australia earlier through time. But what about the northward migration? Well, the northward migration duration is impacted by when they leave Australia. So if they leave later, their northward migration is shorter. But that northward migration is not changing through time. It is not impacted by year. The next step being the arrival at the breeding grounds, that is again influenced by the northward migration duration. If their northward migration is longer, they will arrive at the breeding grounds later, which makes perfect logical sense. But we also see then that they are arriving at the breeding grounds slightly earlier through time. So you can see here that year is not impacting the migration duration, but it is affecting the departure and arrival. So we see that migration window sort of shifting, not becoming longer, not becoming shorter, but it is shifting in time a little bit. This next is going to be a big jump of lots of things. So we'll take a deep breath and we'll go through it sequentially. Let's start by looking at the influence of the arrival at the breeding grounds on when they depart the breeding grounds. There is again this sort of relationship here where if they arrive at the breeding grounds later, they will leave the breeding grounds later. But departure from the breeding grounds is not influenced by year, nor is it influenced by sex. So the sexes leave generally at the same time. The southward migration duration is impacted by when they depart to breeding grounds, which makes sense. So if they leave later, their southward migration is shorter. But that southward migration is not changing through time, so it's staying roughly the same length. And then we get to their arrival in Australia, which is, again, logically influenced by their southward migration duration. The longer their southward migration, the later they arrive in Australia. But their arrival in Australia is not changing through time. I'll also point out we see an effect of sex here, where the males tend to arrive in Australia later than the females. But so taking this all together, the northward migration window is shifting a little bit, whereas the southward migration window is not shifting. Now, let's do a quick loop back into why we should care about this and how we can look at migration in relation to fitness or in relation to an outcome on the population that we are interested in. So the previous presentation, we dealt a lot with sort of the population level abundances, and we looked at survival within years. We looked at juvenile proportions and like the population level. But with geolocators that measure light, we can look at it on an individual level. So because the geolocator measures light, you can actually get an understanding for when they are engaging in breeding behaviors, when they are roosting on a nest, because they're sitting down and the geolocator is not going to be getting much light. So in that sense, we can incorporate an indicator of breeding success into our structural equation model. And that is what this little box was. Nest initiation date is negatively impacted, or is impacted by breeding arrival at the breeding grounds. So if they arrive later, they will start their nest later. Now, nest initiation is an indicator of breeding success. It is strongly correlated to whether they have successful breeding season or not, in that if they actually lay their eggs later, they are less likely to have a successful breeding season. So late arrival is in that way bad, because it means that there's a later nest initiation, which means a lower chance of breeding success. But because we see this northward migration window shifting, there is a positive trend. So they are actually initiating their nests earlier, and there might be some increase in their breeding success, which is nice to see. But let's go back to the other reason that birds actually do any migrations, and that was about maximizing resources. I said that one of the reasons we think birds do these long distance migrations is to gain access to spring resources in the Arctic. But snow is a big impactor on resource availability. When the birds arrive at the breeding grounds, there will usually be sort of patchy snow cover and then snow-free patches. And the turnstones, they'll look around for what looks like a really good snow-free patch, and they'll start building their nest there. But so we have a really strong reason to think that snow melt can impact their breeding success and potentially also their migration behavior. So we added snow melt into our structural equation model. And we find that snow melts 2 years before a year's migration does influence their departure and their arrival timing. And snowmelt within that same year influences their nest initiation date. So snowmelt could potentially be a major driver of some of these changes that we're seeing. But I will highlight here that we're still working on this snowmelt data, because snowmelt is surprisingly tricky to quantify. And I'm happy to talk more about that if anybody is interested. But what we can take from this is that snowmelt can influence migration behavior and nest initiation date, which is quite interesting. So, just taking the time. Let's get to probably one of the more interesting things that people are here for, and that's about disease. As I've mentioned, the window of the northward migration is changing through time, but the duration isn't. The duration isn't changing in either the northward or the southward direction. And that's actually quite good. It means that we are not changing our understanding of when birds might arrive in Australia and might potentially carry diseases with them. The fact that the migration duration is not changing is also a pretty positive sign, because it means that they're not spending longer in regions that have certain diseases like high pathogenicity avian influenza that they might then bring southwards to Australia. So that's good. But there is an ongoing avian influenza panzootic that is capable of causing extreme mass mortalities and has impacted lots of charadry forms, which is what these shorebirds are. Now, this figure is from 2025 and it's already out of date because Australia now has a number of cases, but it was one of the last affected places. And the first notifications were in seabirds, and now increasingly we're getting some notifications in terns, but we don't yet fully have established spread. So another thing I want to highlight with this map is that our turnstones fly through some of these regions and have stopovers in some of these regions where there are lots of reported cases of high pathogenicity avian influenza. Another thing I will point out is that while the migration timing isn't changing through time, there is something to be said for the duration of migration. So the northward migration is on average 42 days, so it's quite swift. So the birds go from Australia up to the Arctic in just over a month, and they really leg it up north. But going south, they really take their sweet time. It's on average around 76 days. And that means that the birds are stopping and hanging out in parts along the Asian coast and Southeast Asia before they get to Australia. And so there's a chance that because they're spending more time here in the southward migration and the northward migration, that increases potentially their risk of encountering and contracting high pathogenicity avian influenza or other diseases. But the good thing is these windows, these durations, they aren't changing through time. So it's not like the risk is changing, just the risk is still there, I guess is the outcome. I think as well, probably everybody here is thinking, but it's not the ruddy turnstones that brought high pathogenicity avian influenza to Australia. So, what are we doing about this? And I thought I would just talk briefly about two projects that we are working on right now that are related to this. And the first one, oh yes, sorry, I should point out, bird flu has not been found in our turnstones yet, but it has been found in a couple of giant petrels and terns. So one thing that we are looking at increasingly now is about incursions coming from the south. So the turnstones, they'll migrate north and then back, but what we have seen with giant petrels is that they are coming from south. They're coming from Antarctica up to Australia. And so we're doing a bit of work right now looking at short-tailed shearwaters and using geolocators, which is the same thing we had on the ruddy turnstones, to understand their movements and their timings. We're also doing some research on what the establishment and spread of influenza might look like within Australia, where it might be spread via ducks. And so we are working with ducks that have been tagged with sort of GPS locators. These are all works in progress, and I just thought I would raise them because I think they're of interest to anybody who is in the high pathogenicity avian influenza sphere. And if you are interested in this, I'm happy to chat more about it and keep you in the loop about how that work progresses. But as I said, it is still very much work in progress. So to sum it all together, we do see some changes in shorebird migration. It is northward direction becoming slightly earlier, linked to snow melt, and it might have impacts on the reproduction. When it comes to avian influenza, we don't see any changes in their arrival in Australia or in the duration of the migration, which is good, but there is an ongoing panzootic, and we're looking at what that's going to look like in Australia. Thank you so much for your time. If you have any questions or thoughts or anything, or if you would like to read the interim reports that we have submitted as part of this NESP project, you can please email me. Thank you.